Thank you.
Senator from the 21st is recognized for question.
Thank you, Senator. Do you yield?
Yes, Mr. Leader.
Would it be okay if we put the prior graphic up on the screen? The one that dealt with the reserves.
The one that dealt with the reserves. Now that's a whole different little PowerPoint.
That was it. She's got it.
We got it. It's coming.
I'll begin without the
Okay.
without the graphic. Senator, would you agree that the reserve fund itself may fluctuate throughout the year?
Yes, under the old plan and under the new plan, I believe that it would. Yes.
So the figures for the reserve that we had represented up on the screen is simply a snapshot of the reserve fund at a given point in time, but it most certainly is not the exact amount of reserve that is in there the next day or the day prior.
That's correct. This would be the amount that is in the reserve fund at the moment that, I assume this is a fiscal year 2012 bill. And so at the moment this bill takes effect, which will then balance the inflows and the outflows, that's what would be in the account.
Senator, would you further yield?
Yes, Mr. Leader.
Would you agree that at some point in time, since we've established the fact that the reserve fund fluctuates, then in fact the amount you represented on the screen may not be the amount of money that's actually in the reserve at a later date and time?
Yes, that's certainly true.
And Senator, could you see the possibility that your amendment, which requires funding to come out of that reserve fund, may not be able to be effectuated if in fact the reserve fund is lower than what you've represented at this single snapshot in time, and without knowing the exact amount of reserve funding for the entire year and at all times, it would be very difficult for us to make a spending policy based on a reserve fund that changes?
Well, and thank you so much for your question. Let me say there's two things, if I may. One is my understanding is that the requirement for the amount of the reserve at the end of the fiscal year is 50% of the previous proceeds. That's the provision in HB 326, which I assume is calculated based on some reasoning for how much you're going to need at the end of the year. So as of fiscal year, the end of this fiscal year, there will be enough money in the reserve to cover whatever costs we project are coming, plus $200 and something million. In addition, to be very clear, and I very much appreciate the Majority Leader's question, this bill, this amendment specifically says in lines 10 and 11, provided, however, that the amount of the scholarships and grants shall be subject to available funds in the shortfall reserved. So if there is not enough money, then we will adjust the amount of the scholarships and grants, but we will do the most we possibly can to grandfather in the current students.
Does the Senator further yield?
Yes.
Under the scenario that you just created, is there a possibility that with requiring that funding be there, that the funding could actually in the reserve go down to zero?
No. I mean, the bottom line is we are going to pay for these students under HB 326. And there's a reserve built. I mean, it's possible. If that's possible, then the reserve amount that is specified in the bill is improper. Because if we're going to pay for all of these students anyway under HB 326, the governor's plan, and as I understand it, the sponsors of the bill believe that the 50% reserve is sufficient to cover any possibilities or changes. And so what we're going to do is use the extra money over and above the requirements from HB 326 that have been calculated by somebody to be sufficient to cover these students, and just use that extra money to do what we can without dipping below that reserve, because we're going to be paying for them anyway. If that wasn't clear, I can probably say it again. But
does the Senator further yield?
Yes.
We've established, or I think we've all agreed, that the 50% reserve amount is sufficient for covering the cost assumed in House Bill 326.
Correct.
Your amendment would have that reserve fund pay for additional costs to the tune of over $100 million.
Correct.
If we do not know the lowest point during the year at which the reserve fund may dip, is it possible that that $100 million of additional spending contemplated in your amendment may be in excess of the amount that's in the reserve fund at any given point during the year?
Again, with all due respect, I think that the answer to that question is no, because if the 50% reserve amount is sufficient to cover, so that even if that 50% reserve amount under the HB 326 were to go to zero, you would still have, because that 50% reserve amount is calculated at the end of the fiscal year. At the end of the fiscal year, we'll have and I have to go to my next slide if it's okay. We'll have $239 million in that account. Now, the 441 is calculated to ensure that will not zero out. And if it does zero out, there's still going to be $239 million in that reserve account, unless the math that supports HB 326 is wrong with regard to the reserves. Because at the end of the fiscal year, they have calculated that at the end of the fiscal year, they need $441 million. I'm saying there's still $239 million. Now, my assumption is they're right about that top number. That's all they need. If that's not right, then we need to change HB 326 in other ways. That means this 239 is excess, and that we should use it, in my view, to grandfather in the students to the best of our ability.
Senator, one final question. Is there a point at which the reserve fund could fall that you would consider that to be dangerous?
Yes.
No further questions.
Okay.
Chair recognizes Senator from the 40th.
Gentleman yield.
Yes.
Senator, I commend you for all your work and your figures and the time you've put into this. And the majority leader asked my question more about the cash flow situation, and I think you answered that to the best of your knowledge. My question is, I'm trying to understand, because we're gone to one reserve account, where does pre-K fit into all this when we're talking about the excess reserve and funds, and if we want to put more money into pre-K and do things, how does that fit into this calculation? Because my understanding is everything is going into basically one pot, and as you know, there's different components in the lottery, the GED component, of course, but the biggest one other than the HOPE, of course, is pre-K. And as you know, a lot of us want to try to expand that down there. What effect does pre-K have when you're talking about the excess money and so on and so forth? Because I can't tell from this.
Right, and you know, that reserve that is required by HB 326 is a reserve for both the HOPE scholarship and the pre-K scholarship. And so the question then becomes, that excess money over and above what has been calculated by the governor to be sufficient is excess. So my plan, and I say this, you know, I assume that 441 million is sufficient, because that's what we've been presented with from the governor. And my policy argument is to take that remainder that's excess and spend it with regard to the current students in the HOPE scholarship. But you'll also notice, based on this next slide, that there would still be about $60 million left over for any pre-K or other expenses.
With further yield?
Absolutely.
As you know, we cover about 53% of the kids right now in this state for pre-K. And I guess what I'm concerned about, when the majority leader raised the point with you, if there's any possibility that this wouldn't be adequate with your amendment, how, again, down the road would this affect pre-K? Because at the end of the day, I'm one of the believers that, you know, if that child can't read by third grade, we don't have to worry about the HOPE scholarship. So I just was trying to figure out where the pre-K fit into all of this.
Well, and thank you, Mr. Senator, and I respect very much your beliefs about pre-K, and I share them. And frankly, you know, if there's excess reserves now at the end of this period of time, I think devoting some of those to pre-K would be good. We don't have good numbers from that we understand and that we have been demonstrated with regard to how much it's going to cost to grandfather in students. As I said, the regents say 58 million. The governor's office says 180 million. You know, what we're trying to do is say, look, we know there's enough money out there over and above what they've already been calculated as necessary. So we can do one thing. Now, if there's more and we can do other things, I think we should definitely do that. And as I understand, you know, the pre-K appropriations process is coming up, and we may be able to deal with that then as we move forward. But what I would love to do is work with you and others in the governor's office to ensure that we maximize the amount of money that we spend on pre-K as well.